Okay, we're live. Okay, understanding carbohydrates 101. Welcome, Will. Just dropped in a bit late. Yeah, so we're going to go through everything that you need to know regarding carbohydrates in terms of what they are, what the main roles are, their aid for performance, and how to essentially optimize them to not only build a flexible diet, but perform at your best day to day. Okay, so in terms of what are carbohydrates? So, carbohydrates, organic molecules typically classified according to their structure, and they are the only non essential macronutrient group within protein, carbs, and fats. Structurally speaking, there are two types of carbohydrates split into simple and complex. So, simple carbohydrates, smaller, more easily processed molecules known as mono and disaccharides, since they contain either one sugar molecule or two sugar molecules linked together. So, put simply, no pun intended. This is things like your white carbohydrates, your sugars, things like fruit juices, that kind of stuff. So you'll all have heard of simple and complex carbs, with complex carbohydrates being polysaccharides. So it's basically how many sugar chains or glucose chains are linked together. So put simply, how easily your body can break them down when digested. Okay. So in terms of how that's ranked, your simple and complex carbohydrates are ranked using the glycemic index. Okay, so typically speaking, if it's 55 or less, so the scale's from 0 to 100. If it's 55 or less, this is considered a low glycemic index food. So it means that it's probably more complex and it's released into the bloodstream a lot slower. Okay, so 56 to 69 is a medium scale glycemic index. And then you have high glycemic index, which is 70 or above. So this is stuff like your fast acting sugars, things like sweets, pick a mix, Haribo, that kind of stuff. So in terms of what we use glycemic index for, I'm going to get into this a little bit later. We can use it to essentially determine what kind of carbohydrates you should be consuming when throughout the day. Well, mic on mute. I'm going to mute him. There we go. Yeah, so we use a traffic light system. So low GI being green. Typically, these are the types of carbohydrate sources that we want to be in throughout the majority of the day. Okay, so again, splitting it into the traffic light, orange being medium GI and red being high GI. So we'll get into more detail in terms of their importance a little bit later on and the role that they play. So the role of carbs. All carbohydrates we consume are digested into monosaccharides. So basically, no matter how complex the carbohydrate is, eventually your body will break it down into its simplest form, which is glucose or sugar, and it can then be absorbed within the body. So carbohydrates are primarily the main energy source for short, high, medium intensity exercise. So stuff like your sprinting, or typically your resistance training sessions that last up to an hour. So one thing you need to understand with this is that high levels of blood sugar do stimulate the pancreas to release the hormone insulin. So if you have a lot of fast acting or high GI carbs, it's going to spike your blood sugar quite high. So the body will release insulin from the pancreas to essentially regulate your blood sugar. So there's different ways that this can then be utilized. So it can be utilized as immediate energy for exercise, or it can then be broken down again and stored in what we call muscle glycogen within the muscles, or any spare sugar or carbohydrates that are ultimately not used, they're stored in the liver. So which ones are good and which ones are bad? So the truth is, there are no things or essentially any bad carbohydrates. It's all just contextual. So you'll know all from working with me that I preach an all-inclusive diet. I don't believe you should typically not have any specific type of carbohydrate because they all have their place within your diet, which is why we incorporate the 80-20 rule. We're looking for 80% of whatever food group it is, whether it's carbs, proteins, or fats, to come from good quality whole sources. And then 20% can come from what would typically be classed as bad or not healthy sources that are more palatable, they taste better, and they just bring you a little bit of happiness and fulfillment. So you'll all have your individual go-tos for your sugar fix or your sweet tooth, whatever that is. I know there's a few donut fans in the group, so it just depends whatever it is specifically that you enjoy the most. It's important to just find that balance. So 8% from whole foods, 20% from less valuable sources or slower release sources. Okay, so some of the main things to consider in terms of carbohydrates. So, like I said before, there's no such thing in my eyes as a bad carbohydrate. It's just about a time and a place. So, reason why people consider carbs split into healthy and unhealthy is that healthier carbs are genuinely digested for things like fruit or your brown variations of rice, bread, pasta. They have a lot more fiber in it. So this makes them complex and essentially takes the body longer to break them down. So they're considered healthier because they don't spike your instant blood sugar and then you don't have a crash afterwards. So the non-healthy or bad carbs, like your sugars or your refined white carbohydrates, are often considered unhealthy just because of the effect that they have on your blood sugar. So when we do have big spikes or big peaks in your blood sugar from consuming too many refined carbs, what that can actually have, if it's elevated for a long time, is an inflammatory effect on the body. So what that means is if you're particularly eating a lot of refined carbohydrates, it puts you or predisposes you more likely to suffer from things like type 2 diabetes or what we call insulin resistance. So when your blood sugar is elevated for a long time, your body, like I said before, secretes insulin from the pancreas. And the more that we're doing that, the less effective the body becomes at doing it because we essentially are using up those insulin stores as well. So it's important to just try and aim to have a consistent level with your blood sugar throughout the day to avoid big surges in energy drops from having, peaks and troughs in your blood sugar levels. So like I said before, it's crucial that you view carbohydrates based on the context that they're needed. So, you know, in terms of what I was talking about, the complexity or simple versus complex carbs, there is other variations and considerations to take into account. So carbohydrates consumed on their own typically will be broken down if they're complex within 1 to 2 hours, whereas simple carbohydrates can be as short as 10 to 30 minutes to an hour. Okay. But when they're consumed with other macronutrient groups, such as fats and protein, this does slow down the digestion of them and make them more complex. So you don't have such a big surge in and peak in that blood sugar. Okay. So, like I was saying before, it's important to mostly consume your carbohydrates from complex sources, but less complex or simple sources do have their place as well, based on making sure that you are enjoying stuff and from a palatability perspective. So, let's move on. Okay, so carbohydrate timings for optimal performance. So a lot of you will have heard what I was talking about before in terms of simple and complex carbs, but we're now going to look into a little bit more detail in terms of the application of how you would incorporate different types of carbohydrates from a performance perspective. Okay. So if you think of the term, give the body what it needs when it needs it. So what do I essentially mean by this? So as we described earlier, carbohydrates are the main energy source for low to medium intensity exercise like resistance training, which you all do. So if the goal is to build muscle, we need carbohydrates to essentially perform in the gym and perform in our big compound exercises, right? So if we're training on, say, a Monday and we have a resistance training session scheduled in, chances are we're going to need carbohydrates on that day. So for those of you who are looking at it from a fat loss perspective, your calories, you're probably on slightly less carbohydrate, a carbohydrate diet than somebody who's trying to gain weight. So if you're limited on the carbohydrates that you can have, we're going to really want to center them around your training. So you're giving the body what it needs when it needs it. So whether that's before the workout, inside the workout, or post workout. Okay. So just thinking about it from that perspective if you're on a fat loss diet, should really help give you a little bit of a better perspective of like meal timing. Okay. So we're going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So going back to what I was saying about in terms of give the body what it needs when it needs it, using that training day on a Monday as an example, if you were resting on a Tuesday, would you typically need as many carbohydrates in that day? Probably not. So that's where things like carbohydrate cycling come in. So that if you were using or exerting less energy on a rest day, do you need as many calories or carbohydrates? Probably not. Now, if you're typically someone who struggles to stick within a specific calorie target across the week, I wouldn't advise carbohydrate cycling because the main focus is just to maintain a consistent calorie deficit across the week. So adding in high and low days with your carbohydrates is only going to confuse things. So it is a slightly more advanced method of looking at it, but it does have its place when you're getting down to quite low body fat percentages. If you're just looking to tighten things up and reclaim a few calories from your rest days. So let's look at when, what, and how in terms of carbohydrates. So overall, you guys are quite lucky that it's easy for me to calculate your individual personal, macro targets and your calories, your carbs. But as a general rule, carbohydrate recommendations or dosages range from 6 to 10 grams per kilo of body weight, depending on gender, physical fitness, and individual training load and stuff like that. So generally speaking, all of you that are in this group now will be doing 4 to 5 resistance training sessions a week. So I would class that as medium to high energy expenditure, which means generally speaking, you're going to get to eat more carbohydrates than the average sedentary person. So this is why I always try and hammer home with you all that the more muscle we can build in the gym, the more calories our body will naturally burn at resting. So you can consume more calories without putting more fat on. But in order to do that, we need to train hard in the gym. So this is where that balancing point comes in with we need enough carbohydrates to perform well and get stronger and make progress, to build muscle so that we can keep body fat off once we get to our goal weight. Does that make sense? Okay. So in terms of, let's look at breaking it down into pre-workout, intra-workout, or inter as a spelling mistake, and post-workout. Okay. So if, for example, you were on 150 grams of carbs a day, let's say, which I know quite a few of you are. So if you were on a training day, what you would maybe look at doing is having, obviously it goes down to personal preference again. It's a trial and error method of what works for you. But if you're on 150 grams of carbs, generally speaking, you'd want a good majority of your carbohydrates pre-training in the meal beforehand so that you feel fueled up and ready to go to push yourself. You all will have been there when you get to the gym and you've not had a big enough meal or substantial meal in you. You do a couple of sets and you start to feel a little bit shaky. So that just comes down to managing your pre-workout meal. So as you can see, we've put 1.5 to 3 hours prior to training. Now, this will vary again per person, but generally speaking, if we were looking at that 150 gram carb example, you might want to have half of your carbs pre-workout, okay? Just so you feel nice and replenished, nice and full and ready to train, okay? So inter or intra workout, sorry, I just missed out one thing. So the quality of the carbohydrates for pre-workout, you're looking to have low GI carbs or complex carbs so that they give you a gradual release of energy throughout your session. You don't want to just be smashing loads of sugars before you train if you're on limited carbs, because generally speaking, like we said earlier, they're going to be broken down into the bloodstream very quickly. You're going to peak, your blood sugars will peak, but then they'll also come down very fast. So you might get to halfway through your session and start feeling a lag, a little bit of muscular fatigue and dizziness. So it's about that gradual release of energy, filling yourself up with low GI complex carbs an hour and a half to 3 hours before we train. Okay. So looking at intra workout, now you'll notice a trend here as we generally go up through the GI scale. So intra workout, so during or when you're training, we're looking for medium to high glycemic index carbs. So this is something in the mid range. So you're looking at fruits. So a lot of fruits will have fast acting sugars in them, but they've also got fiber in them. So it slows down the release of that sugar or glucose into the bloodstream. So during training, what we generally recommend, so some of you will have experienced like intra-workout carb mixes that you can buy, or supplement mixes. So generally speaking, they'll be around 30 to 60 grams which is, 60 grams is the max per hour that you can digest in terms of carbohydrates. So the dosage would be around, again, 0.7 to a kilo per gram, per kilo of body weight, sorry, in order to maintain that normal blood sugar level. Okay. So you can see just how looking at prioritizing your carbohydrates around your training is generally just going to leave you feeling a little bit more switched on, and be able to perform at a higher rate if you keep your carbohydrate levels topped up. So post workout, this is when you've had a big session, squats, deadlifts, bench, whatever it is. You've exerted a lot of energy in your compound exercises, and it's a case of you're looking to replenish the glucose or glycogen stores, which is, sugar stores within the muscle and your liver. So for this, we want to do that as fast as possible. So this is where what I said before about there's no such thing as a bad carb, because they all have their place. So typically speaking, would you want to have some Haribo and, sugary cereal first thing? Probably not, because it's going to make you crash quite quickly in the morning. But when you've immediately trained and you've used up a lot of your muscle glycogen, a lot of the sugar, this is a fantastic opportunity and time to manipulate fast acting carbs to your benefit without necessarily experiencing that drop in blood sugar. So you'll all probably have seen me walking around Graft House or on my Instagram stories with a bag of Haribo wherever I go when I'm training. So I'm a sucker for sweets, pick and mix, that kind of stuff. So for me, having them post workout is a fantastic time to enjoy a fast acting sugar that I really love, but also have the full benefits of the fast acting carbohydrates, because they're going to be the best thing for you post workout. Okay, so again, dosages, you're looking at about a gram to 1.5 grams per kilo of body weight during the first half hour. And again, 2 hours for, so I should say 2 grams for 4 to 6 hours afterwards, in order to fully replace liver and muscle glycogen stores. So you guys don't need to worry too specifically about that. All you need to know that is roughly within a 2-hour window after you train, you're looking to get high GI or fast acting carbs into your body as soon as you can to replenish yourself after that session. So you'll have all had those sessions where you've absolutely tanked it in the gym, you feel really flat, and you feel like you need to go and grab a Lucozade and just top yourself up. So that's why, because your blood sugars have dropped right back down, and we're just looking to bring that level right back up again so that it's at a nice average. Okay. So that's pretty much the bulk of carbohydrates. Does anyone want to pop into the chat any questions, ask anything about what I've gone over in terms of timings, simple and complex qualities? But if you don't, we're just going to get on to a few myths surrounding carbohydrates, so some true or false stuff. But feel free to pop any questions in the chat anytime. I'll answer them at the end. Okay, so we're just going to break down some of the myths that you've probably heard around carbohydrates. So consuming too many carbs makes you store body fat, which is false. So you'll all know from the nutrition modules in the group and just generally your own education that in order to store body fat, it all comes down to energy balance. So if we're using the seesaw analogy with calories in versus calories out, if we're consuming more calories than we're burning, that's what's going to cause body weight gain or fat gain. It's not necessarily determined by which macronutrient group you're overeating. It's about the total quantity, not necessarily the quality. Same goes for fat loss. So carbohydrates massively improve short-term, medium-term performance for spells of exercise, which is true. So going back to what we said, the number one energy source for short to medium bursts is carbohydrates, and that's why we're really focusing on centering them around the training with pre, intra, and post workout. Okay, so the opposite to consuming too many carbs makes you store body fat. Low carb diets make you lose fat faster, which is obviously false. So there's been a lot of media spells, and when you've got to think of with anything nutrition, if they're trying to make extreme claims, or whatever you see in the fitness industry, if they're trying to make extreme claims, chances are it's because they're probably trying to push an agenda, which is back to some kind of financial gain. So people who push low carb diets, like the ketogenic people, is because they're going to make money off selling the products that go with it. So low carb diets don't particularly make you lose fat any faster. Going back to the energy balance scenario that we just talked about, it's all about the energy balance in total across the space of a week and making sure that you're in a consistent calorie deficit. So we're burning more calories than we're consuming. It doesn't specifically for fat loss matter what those macronutrients or the food total is made up of. It's more important that you stay in the deficit for fat loss, okay? So last one, when muscle glycogen or sugar stores are full, it creates an anabolic growth environment for your muscles, which is true. So in order to actually build more muscle, so going back to what we said, the benefits of building muscle are you burn more calories at resting. So the more lean tissue you can carry, the more food you can consume without putting weight on. Now, in order to do that, the more muscle you grow, the more muscle glycogen or sugar you have to fill it with. Okay. So when you do that, it actually allows you to grow more muscle when you're fully replenished because you can perform better in the gym. So you can lift more weight, do more reps, ultimately cause more stress on the muscle, which is going to result in more growth. So when you're thinking of getting stronger, I want you to just think about carbohydrates and performance quality. Okay, guys, so that's the last of the myths. If you guys have any more questions, just let me know. But I think we've covered some solid stuff in there. And again, if you guys want to revisit this, it's going to be uploaded into the nutrition section. I would recommend rewatching it because we got through that quite quickly within the half hour. And every time you watch something like this, you will pick up more and more little golden nuggets that will just sync with you. And the better understanding you can get around all of the nutritional stuff, the better you're going to perform in the gym, you're going to recover, and you're going to get better results at the end. So if you are wanting to do a little bit of extra research, guys, or get a better understanding of, so going back to glycemic index and the food check, there's a link there which you can basically enter into it any food that you would normally eat, and it'll tell you the glycemic index of that food, essentially how quickly the carbohydrate is digested into the body. So maybe write down a little task for you all is to write down 5 or 10 of your favorite carbohydrate sources that you eat on a day-to-day basis, and then just put them into the glycemic index search box, and it'll tell you whether they're fast releasing or slow releasing carbohydrate sources. So going back to what I said before, generally speaking, we're wanting to consume 80% low GI or complex carbohydrate sources and 20% high GI and fast releasing simple carbohydrate sources. Okay. So if you wanted to read up and get a bit geeky, a little bit more about carbohydrate requirements for athletes or guys like yourself who are all performing at higher level within the gym, there's the British Journal Science Med stuff on there. There's loads of journals about different requirements in terms of protein, carbs, fats. Feel free to have a listen. Same on the Precision Nutrition website. So they have loads of free resources on there that you can read up on. A lot of the information that I've used for today's seminar is in there. And finally, for those of you who are into your podcasts and getting a lot of steps in at the moment and just want to, you know, really fine tune your understanding around nutrition, the BTN Academy podcast is really good. It's run by a guy called Ben Coomber. It's something that I listen to just, you know, top up my knowledge now and again. And they cover loads of stuff on like myth busting, you know, intermittent fasting, different protein and carbohydrate sources, but whatever you could think of, they do podcasts on it. So there's loads of extra information there for you guys if you do want to find out a little bit more about any of the stuff we've gone on about. But generally speaking, I think if you all took notes on that, you should have taken a lot of key things away from it. And if you didn't, feel free to rewatch it in the lab. That'll be going live. So yeah, that's all from me, guys. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat. I'll hang about 5 minutes. But if not, feel free to get off and make sure you've all got your check-ins done.